Good evening, everyone. Welcome to session 6A of the Global Initiative's first ever 24-hour organized crime conference. I am extremely pleased to be moderating this session on police integrity. In fact, this book panel announcing the launch of a book published this year by Routledge. I will shortly be sharing a link where everyone can visit the homepage of the book, buy it. You can also download it if you have an academic subscription through a library. I'm especially pleased to be moderating this session on police integrity, which is an issue very close to my heart. If I think about the news stories from the past year, with the huge focus on the Black Lives Matter protests in the US and also the End SARS movement in Nigeria, the issue of police accountability has been front and center of amongst several very important global issues. In South Africa, I can't think of a single period where a issue of police integrity hasn't been part of one of our most pressing national conversations, whether it's through the police involvement in the Marikana massacre, to corruption scandals in the police administration, to just general dissatisfaction with rates of violent crime. So this book is really an incredibly valuable contribution of empirical research and discussion about the issue of police integrity. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I will explain how the session will run. We have three authors of the book with us tonight. Andrew Faull, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program. He has 15 years experience researching and working on police, corruption, identity, violence protection, and civilian oversight in South Africa, and has also spent 7 years as a reserve constable in the South African Police Service. He is also the author of 2 other books about South African police. Sanja Kutniak-Ivkovic is a professor at the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University in the USA. Dr. Ivkovic is currently serving as the chair of the American Society of Criminology Division of International Criminology, and in 2017 received the Mueller Award for Distinguished Contributions to International Criminal Justice. Her research focuses on comparative and international criminology, criminal justice, and law. Adri Sauerman is a legal counsel in the resource and energy sector and independent scholar. As a Fulbright alumnus, he also has a professional background in law as an advocate to the High Court of South Africa. His research in policing and criminal justice has been included in several academic journals, conferences, and book chapters. Responding to the authors, we have John Mascali, assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of North Dakota. His research interests revolve around police-community relationships with a particular focus on the effect of police integrity and police corruption. His research is typically theoretically informed and quantitative. How the rest of the session will work is that we're going to begin with a presentation from Sanja into the survey, which serves as a basis for the book. And after this, John Mascali will take over and pose questions to the panelists to bring out implications of the research. That's going to take us to about 45 minutes into the session, at which point we'll go into the Q&A. I'll be moderating the Q&A, and I'm going to ask the audience members to please raise their hand using the raise hand function. And when I call on you, I'd like you to turn on your cameras. I'll remind people about this later. You can also send questions in the chat box, but I won't be going through them systematically. Without further ado, I would like to invite Sanja to begin presenting her very important research. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the introduction, Simone. The title of our book is Police Integrity in South Africa. It was published by Routledge earlier this year, and I have co-authored this book with Adri Sauerman, Andrew Faull, Michael Meyer, and Gareth Nguyen. I'm happy to report that both Adri and Andrew are also here with us today and will participate in our discussions. Our book provides an in-depth study or analysis of police integrity in South Africa. In it, we use the organizational theory of police integrity to explore the complex set of historical, legal, political, social, and economic circumstances shaping police integrity in South Africa. Our discussion of the theoretical framework is accompanied by the results of a nationwide study of nearly 900 police officers from the South African Police Service, probing their familiarity with official rules, their expectation of discipline within the SAPS, and their willingness to report misconduct. In our analysis, we also studied the influence of the respondents' race, gender, and supervisory status on police integrity. Clearly, in this 10-minute presentation, I can give you just but a snapshot of the book. I will talk about the idea of the book, briefly describe the methodology we use to collect the data, and again give you a quick overview of some of the results. Scholars have attempted to measure police misconduct directly, and they faced a number of challenges, from the police chief's unwillingness to open doors to researchers to police officers' adherence to the code of silence. In such circumstances, scholars wondered how they could measure police misconduct successfully. And that's the question that Karl Lucas and I have tried to answer when we decided that instead of focusing on police misconduct and facing the resistance from police chiefs and police officers alike, we should flip the issue and instead study police integrity. Because we define police integrity as a normative inclination, a belief, rather than the actual behavior, police integrity is much more amenable to empirical measurement than police misconduct is. Second, because police integrity is defined as a feature of individual police officers, as well as a feature of police agencies. This enables us to measure the contours of police integrity within the South African Police Service. Karl Lucas and I have developed this theory of police integrity and the related methodological approach that facilitates empirical measurement of police integrity. To date, this approach has been used by scholars across the globe to measure police integrity in more than 30 countries. The book that we are presenting today is an in-depth study of police integrity in South Africa. Today's South Africa is shaped by its long history of colonial rule and apartheid, marked by injustice, inequality, and violence. South Africa is also a country in transition and is an illuminating location for a systematic study of police integrity and the social, political, historical, legal, and economic factors related to it. We have included over 900 police officers from all 9 South African provinces in the 2 administrations of our survey. Most of our respondents are male, Black, and experienced line officers. The police integrity questionnaire that we used contains 14 hypothetical scenarios that cover a range of forms of police misconduct, including police corruption, use of excessive force, and falsification of official documents. These scenarios describe realistic situations that police officers in patrol may encounter in their everyday work. After the respondents have read each of these scenarios, we ask them how serious they evaluate the behavior described in it, whether they think that it constitutes a violation of official rules, what they think that the appropriate discipline should be, what discipline they expect the SAPS to mete out, as well as whether they report such misconduct. So let's look at some of the results. The first dimension of the theory of police integrity links police integrity with the presence and extent of official rules prohibiting misconduct. According to the theory, in a police agency of high integrity, official rules prohibiting police misconduct have been established. Police officers are not only familiar with the rules, but also understand the rationale for the establishment of the rules and support the rules. Indeed, conduct of South African police officers is regulated by the South African Constitution, as well as numerous statutory and common law rules. Behaviors described in our questionnaire violate these rules. So how likely are respondents to recognize these behaviors as rule violating? Indeed, when you focus on serious forms of police misconduct, such as the abuse of deadly force, striking a handcuffed man in the kidneys, or receiving a kickback, the majority of respondents signaled no problems recognizing such behavior as violations of official rules. However, a substantial minority of our respondents, between 15 and 30%, did not label these cases of very serious misconduct as violations of official rules. Moreover, the percentage of respondents who recognize less serious forms of police misconduct, such as accepting gratuities, covering colleagues drunk driving, or virtually abusing citizens, as rule violations is much smaller. In fact, the majority of the respondents did not recognize that verbally assaulting a citizen is a violation of official rules. But the second topic that I would like to present today targets the police officer views about discipline they expect the SAPS to mete out. This is linked with the second dimension of the theory of police integrity that emphasizes the influence of the police agency's internal control efforts on the level of police integrity within the police agency. According to the theory of police integrity, a police agency of high integrity establishes the official rules and enforces them. In South Africa, both internal and external mechanisms of control have been put in place. Although some of the agencies like the Hawks are no longer in the picture, they play a critical role in misconduct control. The bottom line is that according to the official rules, very few police officers have been disciplined for police misconduct by the SAPS and have been convicted by the courts. After conducting a detailed analysis of legal rules, we discovered that the behavior described in 8 out of 14 scenarios should result in dismissal of officers found guilty. Yet, when asked to predict the discipline that would be imposed by the supervisors in such cases, most officers expected dismissal in only 1 out of 8 scenarios. Even in that case, in which the officer accepted a bribe for a reckless driver, it is not the overwhelming majority of the respondents, but barely 1/2 who thought that the officer should be dismissed. In most other serious cases of police misconduct, the majority of police officers in our study expected some discipline, but not dismissal. In fact, officers more frequently expected either a verbal reprimand or a written reprimand than dismissal. The majority of our respondents did not expect to be dismissed even for engaging in stealing from a crime scene or abusing deadly force. The last, but not least important topic for our presentation today is the code of silence. The third dimension of the theory of police integrity puts the emphasis on the code of silence and the way that the police agency is controlling it. Prior limited research on the topic detected the contours of a strong code of silence among the SAPS officers. The results of our research show that police officers are more likely to protect their colleagues' misconduct when it is perceived to be less serious, including verbally abusing a citizen, covering up a colleague's drunk driving, and accepting gratuities. On the other hand, nearly 10% of the respondents would not report a fellow police officer who engaged in misconduct perceived to be most serious, such as stealing from a crime scene or abusing deadly force. At the same time, our respondents estimated that fellow police officers would be much more likely to stick to the code of silence than they themselves would. In fact, between 20 and 40% said the fellow officers would not report a colleague for even the most serious misconduct described in our questionnaire. The picture of the SAPS that emerges from our analysis suggests integrity challenges. While the majority of the respondents recognize misconduct described in our scenarios as rule violating, the fact remains that 1 out of 4 respondents were not certain about it. In addition, the uncertainty is related to how serious the respondents perceive misconduct. The more serious misconduct was perceived, the more likely the respondents were to say that it violated official rules. Our recommendations are very clear. Police officers should not only be taught the official rules, but also why these rules are important. Similarly, the discipline that the respondents expected is not very harsh at all. It mostly entails verbal reprimand or written reprimand. Although the SAPS should dismiss police officers who engage in behaviors described in 8 scenarios in our questionnaire, the respondents' expected dismissal would happen in just one of them. Based on our findings, we make two policy recommendations. First, the managers should consistently and effectively discipline officers who violate the rules. And second, managers need to communicate the consequences of such transgressions to the rank and file. Lastly, in the cases of serious misconduct, most of the respondents said that they would be willing to report it, while this percentage decreases for behavior evaluated as less serious. In fact, if self-serving bias, the tendency to see ourselves in a better light than we see others, is taken into account, the code of silence among our respondents could be even stronger because a substantial minority of our respondents, between 20 and 40%, estimated that their fellow colleagues would not be willing to report, even in the cases of the most serious misconduct included in our questionnaire. If the respondents are correct that misconduct is not taken seriously by managers, then in order to control the code of silence, the SAPS should strengthen its capacity and willingness to enforce official rules. I'll end my brief presentation here and turn it over to you, Simone, for our discussion.
Thank you, Sanja. That was a great, extremely succinct presentation of really, really interesting underlying survey and results. I'm just going to hand over to John, who has some very interesting questions prepared for the full range of authors. John, take it away.
All right, thank you. So I get to serve in the role as the critic here, and I don't know that I'm necessarily critical of anything that you did so much as I want to know more is kind of there. And so I developed a whole bunch of questions that we can fill the time with, but I wanted to leave a lot of time for the people in the audience to ask questions. And so I'll ask you guys kind of 3 questions to set the stage, right? And I think I'm going to go kind of past, present, and future if we kind of want to think about how we're going to characterize this and kind of lay this out. So the first question that I would ask for you guys is one of the chapters that you see here is kind of a historical perspective on South Africa. There's 2 or 3 chapters that are about this. And one of the issues that's there is definitely kind of like the colonialism, the multiculturalism, and even apartheid, comes through. And South Africa has a very distinct history in that capacity. Are the issues that they're currently experiencing with the police integrity there, as you guys have looked at this kind of in the historical perspective, are these issues part and parcel of the apartheid regime and the apartheid policy, should I say, or is this something that is completely independent thereof? Looks like Andrew's trying to talk, but I don't know if he's being able to hear. Audrey, do you want to take it while we're waiting for Andrew to kind of figure it out?
Yeah, I'll step in here. You guys can hear me?
Yep.
All right, very well. So great question. Of course, a loaded one as well. So I'll attempt the first answer. I think what we tried to do in the book was not really to draw clear causal lines from the past to present day policing. We tried to contextualize really the environments from the past and up to the present in which policing is conducted in South Africa. Because I believe if we viewed the past of South Africa through a policing lens, which is really what we did with the history chapter, it will make for an incredibly depressing cowboy movie, titled probably something like the sometimes good, the bad, and the so much worse. So we try to stay away from that. What we do, or what we did find, I suppose, is there are 2 legacy issues which I think everybody would agree with. One, power abuse of governments. South Africa has always struggled with this, and I think that what feeds into that would be a legacy of violence in society. And I think Andrew has got a lot to say about that. But yes, that's it's going to be also if you look at what we attempted to do in this book for the type of publication it is. And even though it was I think a brave effort at history, if you look at the volumes of history written by actual historians in South Africa, our effort would probably be comparable with a crypt note in a 24-hour history exam.
Thanks, Audrey. Can you hear me now?
We got you now.
Okay. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer, John, but definitely corruption and integrity violations, police misconduct are shaped by the society in which the police are operating. I would say that firstly, as Clifford Shearing once said to me, the police institution is like a ship that is designed to sink. So we know we're not going to have any police organizations that have no leaks. It's just a matter of how stormy the seas are outside. And in South Africa, we've had, ever since there have been professional police institutions in South Africa, we've had a storm waging. I think that there isn't a simple answer, but to add to what Audrey said, I think that the structural injustice of the country puts a different spin on what kind of misconduct might be acceptable and what wouldn't be acceptable. Audrey mentioned the violence, the way that we've developed violence accepting norms in our, on the one hand, the former regime and some private citizens' desire to protect and install white minority rule, and then violence used to resist that, so violence in both senses. The way that violence evolved as a way to solve problems in the private sphere in the absence of a professional police institution during the colonial and the apartheid regime meant that there is, for some people, it's normal to use violence, which is, of course, a violation, an integrity violation, but the organizational culture of the police might think that in some instances it's okay to torture. They might think that the community legitimately wants me to abuse this person who has been accused of being a criminal, for instance. So there is definitely a leaking in of societal expectations of what is considered just abuse and unjust abuse. And if we think of it in terms of violence in South Africa, people talk about many South Africans accepting violence as a legitimate form of problem solving, unless you are the victim and the perpetrator is a stranger. And I think the same might apply to policing. So if I see a police official abusing or engaging in misconduct with someone I believe deserves that, then I might see it as legitimate, whereas when I'm the victim, I might not. So it's blurry and gray, but definitely shaped by the past and also the present. And sorry, the final thing I would say is just the lack, within this context of the stormy sea, the lack of trust in institutions, as Audrey suggested, the fact that we couldn't trust the state in the past, and there was a move to trusting the state with the shift to democracy. But I think with the rising fear of crime, there was an undoing of what was at first renewed trust in the police, and so a rapid unraveling of what were some positive reforms in the early and mid-90s.
Okay, and it's an interesting thing to hear about, like the institutionalization right across a society of these values and norms, because I think that it speaks to a more difficult issue of how you're going to address and solve the problem. You can't change your selection criteria because your pool of applicants are going to be equally, ostensibly, right? They're going to be somewhat kind of affected by the same thing. And so simply just kind of changing who you select to be a police officer isn't going to fix that problem, even if you wait long term, because it's an institutionalized kind of part of the society that's there, which is interesting but troubling at the same time. So thank you for that. The present question that I've got is kind of a two-parter here. And one of the things that dawns on me when I think about organized crime is that there's definitely been instances of police misconduct and police integrity violations that are definitely organized, right? Like you think about like the New York Cab Company, the Miami River Cops, things like that from the US. And then you see other things that are disorganized. How would you guys describe this in South Africa? Because looking at the results from it, it would almost seem that the corruption is kind of endemic to SAPS, and I hate saying it that way, but it looks like it's very kind of widespread through the organization. Is it organized in the sense that, you know, somebody at the top or from the outside is kind of leading and manipulating this stuff, or is it disorganized in the fact that everybody's engaging in these behaviors for a specific set of reasons?
So I can start.
Go ahead, Sonia.
Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So I can start by saying that our attempt is to measure police integrity, and that's a tendency to resist temptations rather than switching at measuring police misconduct. So we can tell you that we have uncovered culture that is supportive of misconduct rather than that we have found that misconduct is widespread. So notice we can tell about that tendencies rather than how they're actually going to behave. And what you find, it is a culture that is troubled with integrity challenges.
And Sanjay, do those come from an organization, like an organized perspective? Like are people socialized into this when they come into the academy, and in the same way that other people kind of go through about acquiring this police culture, or is this imported with them into SAPS, if that makes sense?
Yeah, our question didn't allow us to explore that particular issue. I mean, we can tell you about how widespread that attitude is. In other words, unwillingness to report, or police officers not being able to recognize misconduct as rule violating. But we don't know where the source is coming from. The fourth dimension of the theory of police integrity would tell us that whatever is happening within an organization is also affected by what happens outside the organization. So the first question to ask about the influence of the larger society is related to the current discussion as well. In other words, how the society views misconduct in general will affect how police officers will view it. But also what, let's say, the supervisors do, what the police chiefs do, is going to have an influence on how police officers view this as well. So we can talk about, let's say, some of the former commissioners and commissioners who have openly engaged in police corruption, like Jackie Selby, who were eventually punished for it. Or we have a former police commissioner, Fiega, who openly lied about and covered up police misconduct. So, I mean, if you live in an environment like that, it's difficult to separate whether socialized in, or whether you have not been trained properly, or whether the rules have not been enforced, and hence you end up having attitudes supportive of police misconduct.
And so when you guys think about it, there's an entire chapter in the book that talks about the issue of rank here. And one of the questions that I had, right, was looking at the rank issues that are here and being familiar with this methodology. I was kind of surprised by the findings from the supervisory chapter, because normally supervisors are kind of our bastion of goodness in the night. And in SAPS, they were definitely better than their patrol staff were, but they weren't exceptional in the way that we've come to kind of expect them to be. Is that, can you explain that to the audience? Can you guys explain that kind of the point and the findings here so that it's in your words for it? Because the question that I have is essentially, right, are the supervisors enabling people to do this or not? And I don't think that you guys can answer that question, but it's, to me, that's the crux of this, right? Is because if supervisors are engaging in these types of behaviors the same, or if they're teaching their subordinates, it would require a very different policy solution than if corrupt people are just kind of promoted up through the organization over time, because there's no problems that are there. And so can you talk about what differences you saw between the supervisors and non-supervisors?
So prior literature on police integrity wasn't really consistent in showing us uniformly that being a supervisor matters that much. There is some literature that indicates that supervisors have more positive attitudes, and those attitudes more in line with high integrity than subordinates. But there are also a couple of studies suggesting that really there is no difference. There is not a huge difference there. And when you think about why being a supervisor is important, I mean, you have the right to enforce the rules. You can decide how the police culture is going to look like in your organization. So I think that the role the supervisors play is very important. And we found that this is relevant, but when you put all things together, when you put together their race, their gender, and how police officers view other police officers in the agency, these organizational variables such as whether they perceive that their peers would report, that their peers would evaluate this as serious, turn out to be somewhat more important?
John, can I weigh in a bit?
Absolutely.
So
Simone's keeping us on
to-
track for time, right? Okay, perfect.
Okay, so yeah, I think your questions link together, and I'll build off what Sonia mentioned. I think our finding, so the survey, we can say certain things based on the survey, but of course we've tried to interpret that by drawing on what is quite a rich qualitative record of police research in South Africa, and I think what the survey shows is there is a strong code of silence. And I think what the broader qualitative record in South Africa shows is that we can interpret that code of silence by going back to your earlier question about society and what's shaping it, and the fact that police live precarious lives in South Africa. So it is a middle-class profession. It is relatively well paid, but most police are being recruited from relatively poor households and poor communities. And so getting a job in this national police organization, it's a job for life. We have very good labor laws in South Africa. It's difficult to lose that job unless you clearly violate the rules. And so there are two answers to your question. Firstly, I don't think there's a culture that teaches everybody to abuse their power, but there is a culture that allows those who want to abuse power. And at the same time, the job is so important for those who don't want to abuse power that they are more inclined to put their head down and not ruffle anybody's feathers, not report misconduct, not act against their peers, because this job is able to lift them and their family out of the poverty that they're born into and the injustice of South Africa's past. And I think that mix contributes to this culture of silence, which sees us not acting against misconduct. Another thing on the rank side is, of course, the South African Police Service has undergone a massive transformation in the last 30 years, from an organization that was 50% white in the late 80s to one that is now representative of the national demographics, which would be 80% black, 9% white, and then colored and Indian in terms of apartheid's race labels, which we still use for transformation purposes in South Africa. And part of that process has been the acceleration of people, many of whom deserved to be promoted and some who didn't. And so there's a complicated dynamic of people not necessarily being in the right leadership position, and not having the means to hold people accountable, or the motivation to hold people accountable, and subordinates not necessarily respecting those above them. So there are some excellent leaders and there are some very poor leaders. There are some leaders who would rather have a good relationship with their subordinates than report them for misconduct or act against them. And there are others who will try to maintain a distance and hold everybody accountable, but it's really a mixed bag. So yeah, it isn't what one would ideally see, where it's always merit and leadership qualities that lead to promotion and therefore produce a culture of accountability.
John, I'm going to say we have time for one more question before we go into Q&A.
Okay, so the last question that I'll ask you guys, because I'm hoping that the other question that I was going to ask you is kind of a divergent question that I'm going to pull out of my back pocket here. So the survey was collected at two different time periods, right? You have one kind of bulk of folks who were collected in one time period and a bulk of folks who were collected in another time period. And one of the things that's been happening here is that South Africa has been doing a lot to try to address the police corruption problem. I would certainly say that it doesn't seem, based off of the legislation that you guys present and the kind of history, that this is a strange thing to them. Did you guys see any encouraging signs? Because like you guys were in the book, right, you're pretty critical about the efficacy of some of these solutions, but did you guys see any evidence in your data where the people in the 2018, 2019, when the second kind of set was collected, did you see any differences there from the 2011, 2013 folks? Like, did we see any movement in the right direction, assuming that, you know, these things are representative of SAPS? Did you guys see any of that?
We had a discussion when we started writing the book on whether to present this as two separate samples or just one sample. And I compared their views about almost any variable we can think about. and their views are very, very similar. So eventually we decided to merge the two data sets together. I think one of the reasons is that we collect data in the same way at different police academies. And as a result, we see the same people coming to the academies. So it's the same population. And if anything, I think that their views might have been worse over time, but they remain pretty much the same. That would indicate about the stability of how difficult it is to change police culture. And I'll let Andrew or Adri jump in.
Adri, do you want to comment?
You're not working, buddy.
Adri, you're still on mute.
So yeah, sorry, I missed the last part from Sanya, the audio issues, and it wasn't the mute. So what I can tell you is from doing the legwork in South Africa and speaking with the officers that nothing really has changed. It also, of course, there were several high-profile police corruption cases at that time from national commissioners. So it's very doubtful whether anything really would have changed. But I didn't pick it up. No, the stories remained the same.
Yeah, I think Adri and Sanya can comment on the actual sample more than I can. In terms of what's happening in South Africa, within the South African Police Service, the narrative one often hears is older cops always viewing younger cops as the ill-disciplined ones. And in kind of the early 2000s, I would hear the cops who were recruited in the older system saying the new batch was bad, and 10 years later, you hear the same thing of the cops recruited in 2000. So it's just an organizational narrative. But those who work with discipline do seem to think that police, but in the build up to the FIFA World Cup in 2010, we recruited about 70,000 new police officials over an 8-year period. And there's often a suggestion that those who were recruited in that period are responsible for more misconduct than others. But again, these could just be narratives that one weaves to justify and explain the organization one works in. A final point, I know we have to go to Q&A, but in recent days, there's been quite a wave of arrests and activities against police across the country, some of them very senior. Unfortunately, this is led by the National Prosecuting Authority and a new investigative directorate set up there. So I say unfortunately because ideally the SAPS would clean up its own house, but in terms of those of us living in South Africa and hoping for a better state, that is something to be positive about.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, for some very penetrating questions. I'm going to open it up to Q&A now. If respondents would like to raise their hand to ask a question, I will call on you, and everyone is encouraged to pick the brains of the panelists. We have 2 questions in the chat box, which I'm going to throw out to the panelists to begin with. One is from Chukwuemeka Ngeni. Does the attitude of the citizenry influence or cause police misconduct? And the other one is from Zaid. The current state of policing in South Africa has undoubtedly been shaped by the past. From the author's research, what can be done to change the culture and environment for future recruits to have an environment of integrity? I will also abuse my position as moderator and throw in a question slash a bit more context on the comments about recent arrests. For the audience who are not extremely online South Africans, today we had news of a major arrest of a politician, imminent arrest of a politician that the public has been baying for months, if not years, who's been implicated in very high-profile corruption scandals. We also recently had news of the spokesperson of what is supposed to be the most elite investigative capacity within the South African police, the Hawks, being arrested for corruption. And I would, I mean, it's a bit of a reading the tea leaves comment, but I would be interested if your research on police integrity suggests any way to read these recent events in terms of can we expect that action against high-level officials has an impact? And I'll throw that out to any members of the panel who would like to come in.
I'm happy to talk. I just feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll say something and then others can come in. So perhaps I'll leave the citizenry question to others. I definitely think, well, my one comment would be that the police often blame citizens for bribing them, and kind of it's an easy way out. But I think that we would expect that police to take the lead in shaping culture away from that. In terms of what can be done, I think what we say in the book is that this is really we require a change in leadership in the SAPS. It's not that we have bad leaders, but we don't have leaders who seem able to effectively hold those below them accountable. There is a culture within South African government and police in particular where things are very hierarchical and the buck is always passed down. So if I see my colleague engaging in misconduct, I will feel it's not for me to act, somebody else will do it. And the person above me will think somebody else will do it, and gets passed all the way up and nobody ever acts. And the same thing happens down, moving down. And it happens with acting against crime as well. People are always waiting for others to act. And I think that culture needs to change, and that would change with effective leadership. So there have been all sorts of recommendations made for evaluating the 200-odd generals who leave the organization and moving those who aren't qualified to hold their posts. It would take a while to reform the leadership, but I think that is where we would need to start. We do have, and we have for 3 decades, had some of the best oversight architecture in the world, much of it put in place during the transition. I say best in terms of on paper, we've got everything. They don't necessarily function as they should. Simone, I forget your question. I'm not sure if the Hawk spokesperson was arrested or if he's resigned because he's been accused of corruption. But yeah, it's relatively dodgy. Sorry, I forget your question, Simone. But does anybody else want to comment?
My question was basically, which I think you've partially answered, which is, is the answer in leadership and high-profile action against high-profile figures. The arrest of the politician is not in the police, but it seemed to be evidence of a state crackdown on corruption. But I think you've touched on that. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to come in on the question of the citizenry's role in corruption.
I just want to add
or the other one.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Andrew said in answering your question. Again, reflecting on when we interviewed police officers, that was by far the biggest complaint about the top structure that does not lead by example. So these arrests of high-profile officers and politicians, I believe, will definitely play a part in smoothing out integrity issues in the police a bit more than than what our research shows. I hope so, anyway. Which I think is the kind of tone we use in the book as well.
Audrey and Andrew, can I follow up on and ask you guys a quick question that's kind of my third question that I was going to ask originally. But given that you guys come from the minority group in South Africa, and arguably based off of what I've known, mostly from you guys teaching me, is that you would probably come from a more privileged class than many South Africans or most South Africans. Would the average South African, and especially South Africans that are Black or colored or of other racial or ethnic groups, would they agree with your sentiments about how we need that A, this is a problem, and B, we need to go about solving it in the ways that you guys have kind of articulated and laid out? Like, is there any reason to suspect that those things are differ, or do you guys think that you have a pretty good handle on it?
Okay. Sorry, no, I was just seeing if Audrey wanted to go first. So absolutely, this is a long-standing problem. I mean, in the world, most knowledge is created in the global north. In South Africa and middle-income and developing countries, knowledge is created by the minority elites. And I won't speak for Audrey, but I am definitely a product of apartheid and the privileges that it provided to me and my forebears. And I, of course, try to factor my skewed perspective into the way that I look at the country, but I'm definitely going to have blind spots. In terms of commenting on what needs to be done, I don't think there would be a huge difference at the policy and state intervention level. Different people might have different views on particular cases. So if I'm an angry resident in a community that is suffering under a particularly abusive local police authority, I would think that one is more likely to have an emotional response, whereas somebody like me whose privilege protects him from the everyday experience of abuse, I'm able to have a more distanced response, which I think is natural. I mean, it's kind of like the death penalty debate. It's easy to consult the literature and say, well, there isn't any evidence that the death penalty significantly deters violence, but we know that across the world, including very peaceful places like the UK, most people surveyed would rather have the death penalty. So in that sense, I would expect different responses, but I think that I don't think that our advice is necessarily skewed by our past. What do you think, Audrey?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Andrew. I think we were cognizant of that when writing, because I think it was Jason Kearns who said that authors are often unfairly judged by what they leave behind in words. And so, yeah, we were definitely wary of that. And that's the problem. Once you commit pen to paper from a specific point of view, then and this is something we learned while writing this book, actually, and I see Andrew already smiling, that yes, you tend to commit to one viewpoint and one image, normally to the exclusion of others. And so we try to, well, that's why all of us contributed to when there was a specific viewpoint that we definitely challenged it. And yeah, I think the book is a product of that. Yeah.
I would like to we have a comment in the chat box from Randolph Jorberg. Randolph, I don't know if you'd like to turn on your camera and perhaps ask a question. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it out.
Yes, sure. Happy to do that as well. Hi. Yeah, I mean, my fairly concrete question, usually living and running businesses in Cape Town, comes from the background of, experiencing one of the effects of corruption within the police force, and that is an absolutely ineffective fight against organized crime, the racketeers that I'm suffering from, and the question whether there is like insights on your side, let's say, definitely the experience that nothing is happening, even though action is being promised. And what can the civil society, but particularly the business community, where I got quite a network, would be able to do? Because I also observe quite a, and I'm speaking mostly from a network, of hospitality operators, mostly white or foreign, that have a laissez-faire attitude to, it's always been that way, it will never change, and look at these, idiots, what is happening there, pointing at the police. That what could we, as the business owners that believe in change, do to change the issue of police corruption and all of this?
I'm going to also ask KG, who has a question, to come in, and then ask the panelists to respond to both questions at the same time. KG? Oh, okay. KG doesn't have a question. Never mind. Please respond to Randolph's question, and just to say that we have 5 minutes for the rest of the session, apparently.
Yeah, I want to say that our book doesn't really give you a clear directive of what to do in this case. I mean, this is not the topic of our study, and any advice that we're going to offer you is based on our intuition and what we've studied so far. So in a sense, if you open the book, you won't find the answer there. So what we've recently noticed in the United States is the power of the media, the power of social networks. In other words, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it's about putting the information out and getting the media to pick up the story. So this is, I think, what has led so far to the changes that were starting to occur in the US agencies. And I'm talking here about police misconduct in general, not just about corruption.
Yeah, I think what Randolph is referring to is a very messy situation here in Cape Town at the moment, where we have the nighttime economy has been interfered with by organized crime for a long time. People demanding protection, money, and the police or threatening to come in and mess up venues so that business leaves, and police not responding adequately. And I suppose part of that is that the police who should be responding are being paid off by the same gangs. So I, as Sanya says, this is intuition. This isn't based on our research, and I would be interested to hear others' intuition, including John's perhaps. But I think it requires holding the police accountable, but it also requires the businesses not trying to wiggle out of that blackmail relationship with the gangs. I was in a police car doing research, driving down Long Street, which is perhaps the area in which you work, and one of the doormen of a club walked up to the car and said, "How are you doing?" and dropped a little handful of cash into the driver's lap. And the police official said, "Don't insult me," and threw the money back at him. But presumably that kind of thing is happening all the time. And that is presumably supported by the owner of that establishment. And I realize it's not easy to withdraw from these messy situations, but I know that businesses, and it sounds like you are involved in these networks of businesses, are trying to come together to figure things out. And I guess on the one hand, it's not participating in the systems that are undermining things, while at the same time demanding that the police toe the line and play their part in acting against those that are undermining the rule of law.
Do any of the other panelists have a response? Otherwise, I've been informed we do actually have more time. So I'm going to make a comment, Randolph, which is a bit more broadly on this topic. On when we look at organized crime issues in South Africa, I often want to say, when we're asked for recommendations of what to do, give up on using the police for this problem, because they're too deeply implicated, and police corruption is too difficult to solve. But at the end of the day, you can never imagine a solution which doesn't involve the police and doesn't involve the police having more integrity. And I honestly find it to be one of the most difficult problems to think around when it comes to issues of organized crime, particularly because one of the main aims of organized crime so often is to directly target the police for corruption. And it's simply a very, very insoluble issue that so often requires partnerships across all of society. I really salute your efforts to organize business owners on this issue in Cape Town. I wanted to ask a bit of a broader question, and also possibly bringing in John and his expertise on police corruption, slightly referring back to the comments I made in the beginning of the session, which is that it's clearly a global issue. There are news stories from all around the world touching on this issue of police accountability. And what do you, as criminologists, see as being sort of the big issues that need thinking, more thinking around this? And also, if these are things that are discussed in the book to draw attention to the audience to the discussion.
You guys want me to go first? Sandra, you want? Well, let Sandra have the first bite at the apple.
No, we're fine. I mean, that's the question you wanted to ask. So if you want to start answering, that's fine.
So it's an interesting question, and I think it's a hard question because within South Africa, at least as I'm understanding it, right, and I don't have the direct firsthand knowledge to be able to speak there. And so if I'm off base, I trust that Audrey or Andrew or anybody else will kind of correct me where I'm at. But in South Africa, it's not that there's like there's not a single kind of failure point, if you will, at which we could really kind of like target our efforts to address it, because many of the traditional things that we would tell you would be things like implementing, organizational rules, trying to develop like the organizational kind of commitment through different, means and things like that to really kind of get people to internalize it. We talk about the utility of external sanctions, but the only problem with those external sanctions is that they're often delayed in terms of being applied. The utility of the application, it differs in a lot of things like that. So in cases like that, right, like you clearly need to address the institutional kind of failures that are there in the institutional mechanisms. But I think that this fourth dimension of police integrity plays out in a really interesting way in South Africa, because at least as I'm understanding it from my South African colleagues, is that the salaries of the police officers, while they're good, looking at it from like kind of just like an objective standard of, per capita income in South Africa, it's fine. But the only problem is, as I understand it, that salary often gets divided out amongst kind of like a familial group who may be dependent upon that person who's there, which then suggests that that person needs to kind of go out and earn more, right, in order to kind of support those people. At least that's one ostensible way that's there. So that fourth dimension presents a problem, because if you're always recruiting people in who have the need to do that, I think it's going to be much more difficult to kind of control. And so I think that it may be a larger kind of social systemic issue that would need to be addressed, rather than some of the more targeted things that have happened elsewhere. Like you look at one of Sandra's old students worked in the Ukraine, kind of helping, hire their policing when they transitioned over into more of a democratic model. And one of the hardest things that he had to do was that they had to do these really in-depth integrity investigations on the people who were applying, because so many of them were coming from the old regime or had connections that were kind of nefarious, and they were really trying to weed those people out. If you can do that, that's fine. But if you can't do that in South Africa, then it presents a problem, because, right, like Simone said, you need the police there in order to deal with the crime and the other kind of social issues that are there, right, to varying degrees as the debate is kind of developing. But you need those people there, so you can't just cut off the applicants that are coming in, because there's going to be a diminishing social return, which may actually exacerbate crime and corruption problems in South Africa, right, if I'm pontificating out beyond the data.
Yeah, and it's also an issue of the interplay between the internal mechanisms of control and external mechanisms of control. So I'm talking about what's happening within the police organization, how willing the police organization is to deal with police corruption or police integrity in general. And then on the other side is the issue of how far the society is willing to go to control misconduct. In other words, what is the culture in the society? Are people willing to offer bribes? Is this something that they are willing to do, and how willing they are to go to have police officers disciplined or punished if they engage in police misconduct or if they violate other norms, social norms or legal norms. And then it's a question of establishing these external mechanisms, funding them, making sure that they are actually operational. And we have an example of the Hawks that have been very effective, and I think Audrey and Andrew can talk more about them. And what was the history there and why they have stopped being so effective and why they actually disappeared from the scene. But that's an example of the political will and system as such to establish an effective mechanism of control.
And Sanjay, I think that internal-external debate is really important there. And I think that it definitely speaks to, is it Randolph who raised the issue, right? Who was the business owner in Cape Town, who talked about this issue because, right, like the business community around him that he managed to organize came together and said, you know, hey, socially, we're not willing to stand for this. But they really didn't have any recourse other than just kind of being gaslit by the administrators or the supervisors who heard their complaints. And that poses a problem because you don't really, half the issue for the internal side is that you need people to report misconduct and integrity violations, but then people from the outside need those organizations to actually address them. So I think that interplay is absolutely a crucial point here.
Thank you. Those are very interesting comments. Andrew, do you want to come in?
Something I just wanted to add was that we've obviously framed this whole conversation in terms of police integrity as if there is no other topic to discuss in South African policing, whereas of course there are huge other issues, and one of the biggest is that South Africa has very high rates of violent crime. So if we ask the average citizen, would you prefer to feel safe but have a corrupt or corrupt police organization that you couldn't trust? People, I think, would prefer to feel safe. And that same sentiment informs policing. So police don't book on duty and go, okay, my main job today is to hold my colleagues accountable. The main job is to respond to my performance targets to prevent another crime being reported. And I think that needs to be factored in. And then also just the broader societal issues, like 45% of South Africans don't finish school, 81% don't trust their fellow citizens, 70% don't feel safe walking in their own community at night. All of these things shape these matters so that the idea, although ideally we would all wake up and go to the office as a police official and think it's all about integrity, there are so many other issues that are occupying police officials' minds. And just the last comment, they get 500,000 applications for 3,500 posts. So even if you want to only select the best people, you're never going to be able to adequately vet everybody. So there just are all sorts of confounding challenges.
Andrew, can I push back on what you said here for just a second? Because I think that you're right in the fact that they have other things to do. But right, one of the training issues that frequently comes up for police is like these officer safety issues. And kind of the implication of your comment would almost be that like you can't focus on serving the community while you're focusing on officer safety. Because I think that, and I think what you would say, right, kind of trying to read the tea leaves here, is that you would say that instead what they would need to do is be told to do those things that they need to do to affect crime, but they need to do so with integrity. So it's kind of like almost carrying it with you as the frame that you're using to do these things, rather than as kind of this independent thing that it seems to be to many of them right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I have spent nearly 2 decades trying to improve policing, so I'm not trying to apologize for it. I'm just trying to say that there is nuance that needs to be factored in rather than going in with a single lens.
Okay, I'm going to ask if there are any last questions from the audience. One from Antonello Paparini. As a Latin American, I think some parallels could be drawn between the realities that you described for South Africa and our own ones. In that sense, in the province where I live, the government is currently conducting a survey regarding police conditions and views. I would like the speakers to elaborate a little on the difficulties they found while conducting the interviews with regard to the code of silence. And I would also like to know if they had any insights on how to achieve the least biased information possible. Nice methodological question there.
Well, okay, yeah. If I can answer some of it, I suppose it's about trust in the end. And I think when we started in the beginning of the 2000s, really, Sanja and I started a project, and we were met with a lot of resistance. So we've learned over the years that the more personal approach, spending time with the officers that you're going to interview, or give a questionnaire to is very important to first establish the sense of trust and also that you pose no threat, that you will definitely not report them or their answers, and that's crucial, especially in the SAPS where there isn't really, well, at times leadership is lacking when it comes to integrity related matters. So yes, that's definitely what I would suggest is a more personal approach to interviews and not just chasing the numbers. That's probably, Sanya, why it took so long for us to get all these participants in. But anyway.
I'd like to call on Sanya, but I would just also comment that one of the things that I remarked on when I was reading the book is your discussion of why it's framed as a police integrity questionnaire and not a police corruption questionnaire, and some of the very real difficulties about investigating issues that touch on police abuse. Perhaps in light of the question about the code of silence, Sanya or Andrew, you could reflect on the question in the comments.
So when we designed the questionnaire, we're really careful not to use the words that would indicate any form of police misconduct. So you'll never find a label in it. It's corruption, it's abuse, or the police officer is using excessive force. All of the scenarios are given in in a neutral format. And in the cover letter, we talk about how we want to enhance police integrity as opposed to investigate police misconduct. And I think that language really helps us open doors and make both police chiefs more willing to let us survey the police officers, and also police officers more willing to respond to our questions. And when we've initially designed a questionnaire, we put 2 questions in the back of the questionnaire. One of them is asking the respondents whether they have lied while filling out the questionnaire. And the second one is whether others have lied. So it's really interesting to see what proportion of respondents said they have lied, and we clearly exclude their answers from the analysis. And the second one is the approach that we use, where in the first police corruption question designed, we included a scenario dealing with the use of excessive force. And we purposely put it there because we knew that police officers across the globe wouldn't react to this scenario. They would think that this behavior is normal and pretty much acceptable anywhere. And we knew that then suddenly they start telling us that this is very serious, that they expect to be disciplined for it, or they're willing to report it, that they're actually lying to us. So far that test has worked really well in assessing where we are in terms of measuring the culture.
There's a question here about what the code of silence is, if someone could, is it backed by law?
So the code of silence is the part of the police culture that tells police officers not to report on fellow police officers. And you can find it in any police agency. It's just a question of how thick or widespread the code of silence is. And as a part of our study, not just the study in South Africa, but our police integrity studies in general, we have discovered that the code of silence varies greatly and that it doesn't cover all behaviors equally. So the code is typically more likely to cover less serious forms of behavior. In other words, police officers are more likely to go and report when something is very serious.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the last few minutes. I'm just going to post the link to the book again for anyone who wants to check it out, and ask the panelists, including John, for any last comments on the issue of police integrity.
My only last comments would be is that I would highly recommend the book for people to pick up and read, because it's really interesting to look at kind of the differences that are there. And I think that, as with most good studies, it kind of opens more doors to more questions than it kind of fully addresses at the end of the day. And so I think you guys did a good job with it. And it's definitely not an easy, but definitely an important topic.
Okay, Andrew, Sanya?
Thank you, John. Thanks for that.
So yeah, no, I was
yeah,
also
no.
just going to say thanks, John. Go ahead.
we appreciate that, and we definitely agree. More research is needed. In our last chapter, we actually speak about what is needed, and just listening to actual issues like the one we heard tonight from Randolph shows us that much more should be done about the integrity of the police, and that's why this book is a good start.
Yeah, and I want to say thanks everybody, particularly John, for participating in our discussion and asking questions. And feel free to reach to us if you have any additional questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, John, and thanks to everybody else for joining the panel. And thanks to Simone for facilitating.
Thank you all very much for your contributions, and thank you to our audience. People are joining at very different hours of the day all over the world, so thank you for listening and engaging, and do check out I think there's still 16 hours left of the conference or something, still lots to see, so check out the agenda, and thank you all very much, and good night.